Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 349. This week the questions are taken from guide 420 on the Spanish pre-Dreadnought Pelayo and the Wednesday video on the British Pacific Fleet and its first frontline deployment. So let's begin with questions. BK Zhong asks, in your opinion, between Vanguard, Richelieu and Littorio, which was the most powerful of the 15-inch gun final generation European battleships, accounting for Vanguard being built a few years later than the other two? This is actually a really difficult one for me because, okay, apologies to the Italians, but the Littorios are out of the running on a few grounds. Firstly, there are the issues with accuracy. I think it's overstabilization of shells. Now, theoretically, you could address that, but of course, historically, within their lifetime, that wasn't. But that's less of a factor. To me, the things that knock the Littorios out of the running are their, relatively speaking, short operational range and the insanely short barrel life of their guns. The anti-aircraft battery-secondary battery split also isn't particularly brilliant. So that's what rules them out for me. Yes, in theory, you could argue they don't have radar, etc., 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 but let's face it, the Littorios, well, they only saw action in essentially the first part of and middle section of the Second World War, so that's a little bit unfair, whereas, Richelieu, Jean Bart, Vanguard, they all either enter service later or get refitted later with radar. So theoretically, the Littorios could have had radar if they'd been brought back into service post-World War II, so I don't think that's strictly a mark against them as a design. But their secondary battery and the short barrel life and the short range definitely, I think, would count against them. Also, the Pugliese system, it does work, but it is hugely expensive in terms of volume and requires absolute precision manufacturing, which to my mind makes it a less efficient system compared to the void liquid, etc. systems that you see on the other ships. So that leaves us with Richelieu and Vanguard. Now this is where things get difficult because Richelieu in theory is slightly faster. Vanguard has somewhat thicker armour, albeit that Vanguard's armour scheme is more inclined towards being vertical, whereas, ironically enough, Richelieu's armour scheme is more inclined towards being inclined. But as we saw with the King George V's, parts of Vanguard's scheme will be inclined as much, if not more, than Richelieu's. So, yeah, armour-wise, it's a little bit of a toss-up. There'll be some marginal advantages to Richelieu's layout amidships at longer ranges, whereas Vanguard's absolute thickness will stand it in better stead at shorter ranges, and also the outer ends where the hull curves more, the inclination issue basically becomes a non-difference, at which point, again, Vanguard having more armour is better. And you have a slightly better raw material for the British armour. So, yeah, you can make arguments either way, I think, with the armour scheme. The secondary battery, now that's an interesting one. My temptation, well, secondary and AA, would be to give it to Vanguard because she has the updated 5.25-inch turrets with better rate of fire and better ergonomics, and that is a true dual-purpose secondary battery, plus a ton of radar-guided sextuple 40mm, at least in her original configuration, whereas Richelieu and Jean Bart in their wartime configuration, because they have single-purpose secondaries and then they have 100 mils, their AA battery and secondary battery overall, I think, is significantly below the effectiveness of Vanguard's. And even if you look at Jean Bart's post-war completion with lots more 100 mil, I think overall I would probably just about favour Vanguard in terms of overall efficiency and the fact that 5.25 will shoot further and therefore give you a more effective heavy AA barrage before you get into the medium and short range stuff. So slight edge to Vanguard there. But when it comes to the main battery, Richelieu does have a fairly distinct advantage. Now, I'm not aware offhand of any easy reference armor penetration tables for Vanguard's 15-inch 42s using supercharges, which, contrary to what some might claim, she was fitted to use, even if she was never issued with them because she wasn't ever sailing in wartime conditions. But even so, if you look at the 15-inch 42 armor penetration capability just using normal charges, and you look at the Richelieu's 15-inch gun penetration capability, there's a fairly wide difference. Now, to be fair, even using standard charges, let alone supercharges, Vanguard's guns have a pretty good chance of doing some rather nasty damage at the typical battle ranges you see during World War II. But if they're going to square off in a post-World War II environment where they might be engaging quite comfortably at 25 to 30,000 yards, then you are beginning to look at points where perhaps the 15-inch 42 shell might not penetrate Richelieu's armour, whereas Richelieu can probably do a number on most of Vanguard's armour at similar ranges. This is assuming supercharges. So Richelieu's main battery is more powerful. It just simply is. And they've both got the same battery in the sense that they've got 8 15-inch guns. And Richelieu has them all forward, so she can bring 8 guns to bear while minimising her target profile somewhat. The only thing that's really working for Vanguard in that respect in the main battery is that Vanguard, at least going by firing trials, seems to have the slightly more accurate fire control system and guns, which isn't necessarily that surprising. The 15-inch 42 is a very, very accurate gun, so paired with radar-directed fire control, it's going to be almost a first shot, first hit weapon. But under most circumstances, Richelieu's 15-inch guns are just better. So that means Richelieu, broadly, outside of fire control accuracy, has an advantage for its main battery and an advantage for speed. It's much of a muchness for armour, and Vanguard has a advantage in its secondary battery, at least by my estimations, which would in theory mean that Richelieu is overall slightly the better ship, but it's so close that you can then factor in things like the accuracy of the fire control combined with the inherent accuracy of the guns, seakeeping, where Vanguard is going to win out, I think, on both of those categories, and so forth. So, yeah, I don't know. I think both designs are really good designs. They both have strengths and weaknesses above or below each other. And the fact that Vanguard displaces somewhat more than Richelieu is kind of a testament to the efficiency of the all-forward layout, even if the French didn't use the most efficient form of the all-forward layout. I think if Richelieu had a full dual-purpose secondary battery, then that would tip it over to Richelieu, but she didn't. Scott Mason asks, as someone who is a high-functioning person on the autism spectrum, I've always been curious, how would a navy of the period the channel covers deal with someone on the spectrum if they were accidentally recruited into their navies, or if someone who is high-functioning had willingly joined but suddenly has something that makes them freak out, like a sudden loud noise or being shouted at? I'm assuming it wouldn't be good. Now, of course, not a sociologist or an anthropologist or anything like that, so hands up on not necessarily having full expertise at this point for that, but from what research I have done on the period, and also looking at accounts of sailors and how they act, because of course stuff like autism was not a diagnosed thing at the time. It may have had other terms, but they're very disparate and vary over time, and perhaps only address certain elements of it, because of course and perhaps 100 years in the future people will be pointing at us and laughing and going, ha ha ha, they believed in an autism spectrum, when it's actually 4 different conditions which they'll identify in the 2050s or something. Who knows? Anyway, my point is that sometimes when you're looking at accounts either from sailors or up from sailors about other sailors, you can see people who are perhaps exhibiting behaviours that we today would associate with people on the spectrum, if you like. And with that in mind, I think it would depend very much on what are the, trigger points for people reacting, because of course different people react differently to different stimuli. Sudden loud noises or being yelled at, that's not going to end well for someone in the Navy, because sudden loud noises and being yelled at, that's kind of part and parcel of being in the Navy, and it'll be part and parcel right from training. So, unfortunately, for active duty sailors, someone who reacts badly to that kind of thing probably is never actually going to make it onto a ship, with maybe the rare exception of if they are brought onto a ship as a ship's boy because they're on the route to being an officer. But even then, it probably won't last too long, because an officer who essentially has a little bit of a breakdown when the guns start firing, they're not going to be an officer for very long. However, the flip side to all of this is that, in part because they didn't understand exactly what was going on, but they did understand at the same time that people were different, and there wasn't any kind of, sort of social security welfare net back then. Weirdly, whereas today, if you march into a job interview and say, "Hi, I'd like to apply for this job, but I'm also on the spectrum," you might very quickly find yourself in a position of, "Thanks for applying, but we found other candidates." Back then, people, at least in some circumstances, seem to be much more willing to just go, this one's a little bit odd. So we can't treat him as quote unquote normal, but he does do, or she does do fairly well in this particular area for some reason. We don't understand why, but there are jobs that really need someone who's really good at that, so I guess we'll put them over there. And so if you wanted to stay within a naval context, then let's take one example of a form of people on the autism spectrum. Someone who's really, really pedantic and obsessed with order, with everything being in its right place, with making sure there's the right numbers of everything and everything is nice and rigidly scheduled and sorted and organized. Now, of course, that doesn't apply to everybody, but it's one type, and one of my friends who is autistic, I'm very familiar with this particular behavior because that's him to a T. That kind of person, even if they are somewhat scared by loud noises and being yelled at, would be a warehouseman, i.e. in the dockyard, or a stockist or a purser's absolute dream employee, because you'd essentially be being told, okay, we want you to go into this really big warehouse of stuff that's potentially really disorganized, and we want you to catalogue, enumerate, sort, and regulate everything in here. Oh, and did we mention no one else wants this job because we think it's really boring and tiring, so you don't really have to deal with humans except for reporting back to me at the end of the day what's going on, and occasionally taking requests from people who want stores issued. Now, for someone like my friend, that's an absolute dream job. Yeah, that plays into their nature perfectly. And as far as a 18th, 17th, 19th century stockist is concerned, they're just like, well, he's perfectly happy. How is he happy? I don't know how he's happy, but he is. I'm not going to question it, And he's really good at the job. It's like everything is down to the tiniest detail beyond something I could possibly imagine. We're keeping him. And you kind of see that developing over time. Of course, at the same time, you'd have to run a little bit of interference, because you can imagine, let's say a dockside purser would perhaps be saying, look, I know, Captain, whoever you are, you really, really, really want 6 cordages of rope and 6 pulley wheels and everything. I will go and get them for you, but you can't go yelling at the poor man who deals with all the stocks, because he really doesn't take that very well, and we really need him because he's the only one who could do this job. And you literally see this and other similar scenarios playing out in letters and documents and things, where various officers and other employees, both aboard ship and in dockyard facilities, because obviously if you have a different trigger point than loud noises, then you might well actually end up serving on a ship. You see this in action, where people are going, yeah, don't do this or this normal behavior around this guy because he won't react well. But if you do leave him alone and don't do that thing, he's actually superhumanly, unimaginably good at this one specific task or this area of operations, and we really, really need that particular set of skills. I mean, I'm actually, while recording this, reminded of an account I read from well, it was one of the Razé frigates circa late Napoleonic War of 1812 period, and the chief gunner was basically viewed as a little bit of an oddball. Chief gunner for that gun, not the chief gunner for the whole ship. There was a chief gunner for one of the ship's bow chasers, and as I said, he was viewed as a complete oddball because he didn't really talk to anybody. He would lose his temper if the ship's rations changed at all. He wanted the same thing for breakfast, the same thing for lunch, the same thing for dinner every day, and if you didn't have it, oh boy, would there be a fight on your hands. And he didn't really fraternize with people much apart outside of his gun crew, and even then they noticed he was a little bit awkward. And he spent a lot of time cleaning his gun and talking to his gun, and he'd named his gun. And everyone sort of looked at him and thought, yeah, okay, you do you, mate. But oh boy, was he one of the most accurate gunners in the fleet. That's why he was put on this bow chaser. He could put a cannonball straight through. Specifically, that I says he could put a cannonball through a gun port at 700 to 800 yards, almost every time. Now, if that's not describing someone who's a little bit on the spectrum, I don't know what is. But as far as the Navy was concerned, he's a really good gunner with some odd behaviours. As long as he doesn't get too odd and keep shooting accurately, we're perfectly happy to have him in service. Warrant Officer Will asks, was the fall of the Spanish Navy completely due to factors outside their control, or were there any particular naval defeats that butterflied them into a downward spiral to the bottom? And alternatively, were there any notable moments that could have gone in the opposite direction and kept the Spanish Navy relevant for much longer? I think if you're looking at anything in particular where you could say this was a breaking point for the Spanish Navy, it would probably be the latter part of the Napoleonic Wars, where Spain is kind of forced to switch sides, thanks to the French invading them, because that meant that when you got to the end of the Napoleonic Wars, unlike a lot of other navies that perhaps had lost, like the French, the Spanish Navy, in that very short time period between them switching sides and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Navy took a massive battering. I mean, there was obviously ships that were captured or destroyed in port, other ships that had to skedaddle far away, and of course, with the mainland being invaded, money was incredibly short, maintenance was incredibly short, and significant numbers of ships, including a whole bunch of really nice first rates, essentially fell apart due to lack of maintenance and had to be gotten rid of. So it meant that post-war, where even France, the defeated party in the Napoleonic Wars, had some legacy fleet from which to continue to rebuild, the Spanish Navy circa 1815 1816 was a shadow of its former self. And then combined with, lack of money and so forth, it was on a very much an uphill climb to ever try and rebuild itself. That, I would say, probably is the tipping point, at least in my mind. Outside of that, most of the other factors that caused the decline of the Spanish Navy, while they might have been part of it, i.e. the Navy was part of it, a lot of the other things aren't really within their overall control. Because yes, you have the Spanish treasure fleets, and perhaps relying on the income from looting South and Central America isn't necessarily the safest long-term option if you want to finance your navy. But let's face it, at the end of the day, the Spanish did a relatively decent job of safeguarding those treasure fleets. Yes, there were a number of treasure fleets and treasure ships that were captured, but the fact that they were seen as such massive achievements whenever that happened was because most of the time they weren't captured, or they managed to fight off the attempts to capture them. So there wasn't really a point at which the Spanish Navy failed to ensure that enough money was coming across outside of one or two very short periods, but as a long-term effect on the Navy, that wasn't so much a factor. Another big problem was the lack of experienced sailors who would stay in the Navy in the lower ranks, in, if you like, the enlisted, the non-commissioned side of things. But as we've discussed in previous Drydocks, that was as much a function of long-term Barbary pirate predation of the Spanish coasts, and therefore a overall proportional lack of trained and experienced sailors just generally. There's a limited pool you can draw on, therefore there's a limited pool that you can have for your Navy, therefore you're forced to a certain extent to adopt imperfect systems like the essentially conscription system that they ended up doing. Because, they had good ship designers, they had good shipwrights, they had good ports. Some of the Spanish ships were preferred when they were captured. The Santa Ana class, excellent first-rate ships of the line. And for the most part, their officers generally were pretty high quality. But the overall general crew, as we just explained, were a little bit lacking. And of course, that compounds itself because if you don't have as good a quality crew, the more likely you are to lose them and or the ships they're on, which means you have to bring up even newer, fresher crew, and often on you go. And then, of course, the South American and Central American colonies decide they've had enough of Spanish rule and break off and form their own independent countries, and at that point, the big money tap is closed, and there's no chance of the Spanish Armada ever recovering itself back to its former glory, just because there isn't the money available anymore. But again, that's not really anything the Navy could particularly do anything about, because the fundamental causes of those various revolts are much more to do with the land side of Spanish administration. The Navy could, of course, fight to try and retain the colonies, and they did, but the whole reason they were up in rebellion in the first place wasn't really all that much to do with the Spanish Navy. Orion QT asks, if my understanding is correct, some ships from the French Navy were sent to the Pacific toward the end of the war. What kind of role did they play? Yes, the main star of French presence in the Pacific was the battleship Richelieu, and she served with the Eastern Fleet in 1944 before heading back for a quick refit and cleanup, and then she came back in 1945, but she didn't serve with the British Pacific Fleet. In fact, she served with another formation which, well, if you think the British Pacific Fleet and the Eastern Fleet are somewhat forgotten or overlooked in World War II, the East Indies Fleet is even more overlooked, because essentially at the end of 44 you had the majority of what had been the Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean transformed into the British Pacific Fleet, and then that headed over to the Pacific itself to frontline duty. But that meant there was still a whole load of other ships left over. So you had the battlecruiser Renown, HMS Queen Elizabeth, they would have had Valiant, except Valiant fell off a Drydock, as well as a whole bunch of escort carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, because while the front line was obviously up at Okinawa and Iwo Jima and so forth, the Japanese still had a reasonable presence in places like Singapore, so you couldn't leave the Indian Ocean unguarded. So the East Indies Fleet was formed with these older ships, and Richelieu was reassigned to the East Indies Fleet when she showed up again in 1945. Now, the French did, because at this point in 45, most of mainland France has been liberated, so the French government now did want to have a independent French formation operating in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, as opposed to tagging along with the British. However, they ran into essentially the same objections that Admiral King and the US Navy had put against the British taking part, primarily in practical terms, logistics, i.e. can you support yourself in terms of providing your own air cover and your own fuel and resupply, etc., etc. Now, obviously, the British Pacific Fleet had been able to answer that, say, yeah, look, we've got our own carriers, quite a few of them, in fact, we've got our own aircraft, and we've got our own logistics train, even though, obviously, we can also share. Unfortunately, having just come out of occupation and not having been the largest fleet to start with, the Marine Nationale didn't have those things. I mean, yeah, technically they had Bern, kind of, although she wasn't really in a fit state in early 45 to be used for much of anything. So realistically, the French didn't have any aircraft carriers. They couldn't provide their own organic air cover, which was kind of vital in 1945. And they essentially had zero logistics train of their own. And the Americans said, well, we're not providing you with some of ours, so if you can't support yourself, you can't come. And there was also a separate, more political issue, which was that from a, again, mostly politics side of things, the Americans saw both British and French attempts to get involved in the Pacific Campaign as also an attempt by those nations to reassert their colonial holdings in areas, obviously, for the British, Singapore, Malaya, etc., for the French Indochina. And to an extent, they were right. That absolutely was one of the objectives of both Britain and France, getting into the Pacific as soon as they were capable of doing so. But from a pure politics perspective, America didn't want a strong France or Britain, because a strong France or Britain could potentially do things that America didn't want, and America didn't want them to do those things. It is a general political conundrum which would eventually lead to the Suez Crisis and further down the line. But as a result of that, the French couldn't deploy any significant number of units, so Richelieu ended up with the East Indies fleet, although the destroyer Le Triomphant did rock up towards the end of the Second World War, kind of mid-1945 as well, so technically 2 ships at one point. But that was the extent of Free French and then French involvement in the Pacific before the war ended. Vicky asks a 3-parter question with a bit of an intro. So, if you put the keel laying and commissioning dates for the Invincibles, Bellerophon, St. Vincent's, Nassau, South Carolinas, and Minas Gerais, etc., in a spreadsheet and subtract one date from the other, the Royal Navy ships mostly take 800 to 870 days to go from keel laying to commissioning, although there are outliers in both directions. The first 2 Nassaus also fall into this range, but Rhineland and Posen take much longer, and the 4 American and Brazilian ships taking a similarly long to even longer time to go from keel laying to commissioning, with the grand prize for slowest commission of all becoming a tie between South Carolina and Sao Paulo, each of which commissioned 1,169 days after being laid down. So with that in mind, firstly, why did Invincible, and to a lesser extent Inflexible, take so long to commission, and conversely, why was Vanguard so quick to commission? So with Invincible, there's a little bit of a special case going on, because she was actually rammed by another ship while alongside the wharf for fitting out, which of course necessitated repairs, which set back her commissioning time. But more generally, Invincible and Inflexible are the very first battle cruisers. So there is going to be a longer time to commission, because they're kind of brand new things, and it takes people a while to get used to how to do this, and as well as, there's various testing issues as well. Invincible's electric turret drive system did not work, although most of those issues happened, or were more heavily experienced, and more attempts at rectification were made after she was commissioned. There were also issues while she was fitting out. So essentially new ship and new type of ship syndrome for Invincible and Inflexible, plus that RAM. Whereas with Vanguard is the last of the St. Vincents, and of course the St. Vincents themselves are derivations on the Bellerophons, which are themselves a derivation on Dreadnought. So compared to the Invincibles, by the time Vanguard is coming for fitting out and commissioning, people are pretty familiar with how to generally assemble a Dreadnought battleship. There's also a small element of different levels of urgency in terms of, what does that shipyard have next to go either onto the slipway for the build time, or onto that fitting out wharf for commissioning. Because if they don't have anything immediately scheduled, well, there's no point in rushing, because you can still charge the manpower days. Whereas if you've got another ship coming in and there's potentially early delivery bonuses or late delivery penalties, then you get a move on quite quickly. Then, following from that, why the dramatic split in the Nassau's completion times, with those of Nassau and Westfalen forming a tight pair that compares favourably with most Royal Navy ships under consideration, but Rhineland and Posen form a similarly tight pair that's much closer to Invincible or the American and Brazilian ships for completion time. So with the Nassaus, there's potentially three factors playing into this. Firstly is the fact that the Nassaus were supposed to have been built as two pairs, but there were significant delays in actually placing the orders for the first pair, in part because of constant design revisions, because of what they thought the British were doing. And so they ended up being ordered very close to each other, which is why you see that all the keel laying dates are very close. But in turn, that means that the shipyards that had got the contracts for the first two had a whole bunch more time to build up materials in anticipation of the order. And obviously, with everything pre-stocked, with the order coming late, they're able to complete somewhat faster, whereas the other yards, getting a little bit less notice of the contracts, don't have as much time to build up material stock. Another factor is just different yards have different performance levels. In the UK, for example, most of the time the Royal Dockyards are faster than private yards. Each of the Nassaus is built at a separate yard, so I suspect if you look at overall completion times on a per yard basis, you might notice that the yards that built the latter two Nassaus might be a little bit slower, generally speaking. And to a certain extent, almost compounding the first issue, the second pair of Nassaus were completed with slightly different elements in certain aspects, like their turrets were actually slightly updated models. And of course, if you've brought in a slightly updated model, that means there's going to be a slight delay in it arriving, because a new turret has to be manufactured. You've got to figure out how to fit it, etc. And that's not going to help either, especially because fitting turrets is part of the fitting out process after launch. And then the third part of the question, the slow completion times for the American dreadnoughts are pretty much as expected, but the similarly slowly completed Brazilian ships are being built in British shipyards, which are also churning out Royal Navy dreadnoughts much more quickly. Did the specific yards building Minas Gerais just coincidentally happen to catch whichever curse had slowed down the Invincibles? Was the Admiralty putting pressure on the shipyards to take their time building Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo, or was the work slowed by Brazil having intermittent trouble paying the builders on time? There's a mixture of factors with the Minas Gerais. Firstly, they're being built at private yards, and as I noted, private yards tend to be a little bit slower than nationally owned yards, at least in the UK. Another factor is they are, again, a somewhat new type, full super firing turrets and everything, so there's going to be a little bit of a slowdown on that. And there's another major factor when it comes to total completion time for the Minas Gerais. Yeah, the payment issues mean that things are going to go a little bit slower until the yards are assured of payment, but rather pressingly is that they are Brazilian ships being built in the UK. And that means that once they are mostly complete, whereas if they were Royal Navy ships being built in the UK, once they are essentially feature complete, they would be commissioned into the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy would take them off for the majority of their trials. Whereas for the Brazilians, it was kind of the other way around. They essentially contracted the Royal Navy out to do the trials for them, but of course that meant they had to be trialed in the UK. So once the ships were feature complete, the Royal Navy then took them out to sea to do gunnery trials, speed trials, and all of this kind of stuff, brought them back in, fixed the issues, retest, okay, great, it's fine now. And now that you think the ship is fully working, bugs ironed out, etc., you then also have a whole transatlantic voyage over to Brazil, and then once they're at Brazil, they can actually commission. So that adds a whole extra bit of time to the fitting out and commissioning process that you wouldn't get in a more typical environment if the same yard was building an identical ship for the Royal Navy. Titus as the Roman asks, in the video on the British Pacific Fleet, are those F4Fs or FN2s at roughly 4 minutes and 45 seconds into the video? I haven't seen enough FN2s to be sure of their identity. Well, this was a fun little rabbit hole to go down, because the aircraft carrier you can see at that timestamp in the video is here. This is HMS Searcher, and at the time that this photo is taken, most likely late 1944, she's operating 882 and 898 squadrons, or if it's late 44, almost certainly just 882 squadron, because she starts off operating 882 and 898, each with 10 aircraft, but then 898 is disbanded and folded into 882, which then goes on to have obviously 20 aircraft and subsequently a few more, but they're both operating the same kind of aircraft, and in fact will operate the same kind of aircraft from late 43 all the way through towards the end of 1945. So great, we know the time period, we know the squadron, we know the aircraft carrier, and we don't have them operating any other kind of aircraft at the time. It's just the one type. So what type is it? Well, it's the Martlet Mark V, which is incredibly unhelpful because, of course, that isn't a US designation, that's a British designation. So then you have to consult the great book of the F4F Wildcat, and you discover that the Martlet, or Wildcat 5, because they switch over partway through between using the Martlet, which is the Royal Navy designation, and Wildcat, which is obviously the US Navy designation, but either way, the Royal Navy Mark V variant of this particular aircraft is the FM1 type. The FM2 is the Wildcat 6 in Royal Navy parlance. So you're looking here at FM1 Wildcats.
Brian Smith asks, were there any navies that gave or devoted serious thought or design to allowing aircraft to take off from either end of a carrier? Pretty much all the major navies that built carriers in the interwar period gave some thought to the idea of being able to operate aircraft from the flight deck forward or from the flight deck aft. Now, obviously, you can't do this at the same time because you need wind over the flight deck to ensure a short takeoff run, and a ship can't, split in two and go at 30 knots in either direction at the same time. But there was, some thought given to the fact that, well, something might happen that will block that path. So an aircraft might crash, you might take bomb or shell damage, or any number of other factors that might prevent you from being able to use the forward part of the flight deck. And so, well, turn the aircraft around, launch them over the back of the ship. But to do so, obviously, you still need wind coming over the back of the ship. Now, you can do that one of two ways. You could either just turn your ship in such a way that the stern now points into the wind, and that will give you some speed to help you take off. Obviously, you still need to maintain steerage at that point, assuming you're running with the wind. But the other way would, of course, be to put everything in reverse and reverse into the wind, which gives you a greater amount of wind over the deck, which makes your fly tops somewhat easier. So as I said, everyone thought about how this might work should something go wrong. However, the Navy that put the most thought into it and actually adapted their ship designs to a certain extent to accommodate this was the US Navy, because they installed capacity on their ships to have arrestor wires not just aft but forward, and they ensured that the whole form of their purpose-built carriers, at least, was capable of reversing at actually a fairly high speed, and the machinery setup obviously had to reflect that as well. And although they weren't going to be able to hit 30 plus knots going backwards, they were able to hit the high teens of knots at the very least, and that meant that although it's not perfect, in theory they were capable of operating almost as well going in reverse as they were going forward. Certainly fighters and dive bombers, certainly dive bombers that perhaps only loaded with 500-pounders, could operate without any problem whatsoever. A fully loaded dive bomber with a 1,000-pounder or a 500-pounder and a couple of 100-pounders, or a torpedo bomber at full load might have some issues, but that would depend more on the wind strength than anything else. Because if you've got a decent head of wind across the flight deck, even going backwards, that'll more than make up for any potential loss in your own speed. Christopher Villenfort asks, what are the 3 biggest technologies, design solutions, or organisational changes that were implemented slowly or too late without any real good reason? Now, This is an interesting one because there are some where you might go, well, this obviously should have been adopted earlier because look at the results it got. But a lot of the obvious ones are actually, I would say, wrong to consider that they should have been implemented in mass earlier, simply because a lot of the time the reason for their surprising effectiveness was that their lethality increased very dramatically right before they were implemented. So, torpedo boats, for example, or aircraft strikes on capital ships. In both cases, you might think, well, they should have had a lot more emphasis on carriers in the early to mid-30s, or they should have introduced vast fleets of torpedo boats and destroyers earlier than they did. But in both cases, the torpedo boat and the bomb and torpedo carrying aircraft were massively, massively less capable even half a decade before they were put to rather devastating use. So, looking at the ones where I think, yeah, actually this should have been done a lot sooner, I would go with the Royal Navy and the 4.5-inch gun, because ultimately, going up to World War II, you have the 4.5-inch gun, you have it as a dual-purpose weapon, you have it already being installed on aircraft carriers and on refitted capital ships, so you understand all that, great. You have dual-purpose high-angle mountings, you have 4-inch, okay, you might argue, well, the 4-inch mounting isn't big enough to take a 4.5-inch gun, fair. However, you also have the 5.25-inch, which you're installing on the King George V's and the Didos. So it's fairly obvious you do know how to make a large dual-purpose mounting. It should not be that difficult to either adapt the ones that actually exist for the 4.5-inch gun, the ones that you're already using as between-deck mounts, or the ones you're using on Ark Royal for that matter, or adapt the 5.25-inch scale down to fit the 4.5 if you think the between-deck mount isn't going to work properly. Making a dual-purpose mounting for the 4.5-inch gun should not have been difficult, and they did have the time before the Second World War to do so, and it just seems to have slipped through the cracks, partly through inattention, partly through some people being convinced that the relatively low-angle 4.7 was still perfectly adequate, which it really wasn't. So, yeah, you do get split secondaries on a number of other ships in other navies, but realistically, given that some people were even looking at dual-purpose 6-inch, and the Royal Navy itself had looked at dual-purpose 8-inch in the 1920s, I don't think there's that good an excuse as to why the Royal Navy didn't come up with a dual-purpose 4.5-inch as its standard gun for anything that wasn't a brand new capital ship. Cruiser, destroyer main armament, cruiser secondary armament, old capital ship secondaries, carrier, anti-air, etc. That should have been kind of the 5-inch 38 of the Royal Navy. In terms of organisational changes, the merger that you got in the middle of World War II between various bureaus in the US Navy to streamline and actually, get people talking to each other was, I think, long overdue. The almost disastrous mix-up between barbette size and turret size and which gun you were going to use for the Iowas was not the first major problem of interdepartmental communication. And, well, the Bureau of Ordnance having this weird dichotomy of some parts of it doing excellent and other parts of it being absolutely appalling just within itself is a whole other thing. But as I say, these were not unknowns to the US Navy or, well, anyone who had to deal with those bureaus, really, in the late 1930s. Those issues had been exhibited for quite a while, and the various mergers that went on, they made sense, but really should have been done a decade or so earlier. And for one that was technically implemented really late, but essentially didn't see all that much service, but a lot of things suffered because of it, would be the Kriegsmarine's refusal-reluctance to adopt the 127-128mm dual-purpose gun, because, let's face it, that gun is not half bad. It's a decent old weapon, and the Germans knew they had issues with naval guns, not just for split batteries for larger ships, but also for the main armament of destroyers, because the 88mm was really a bit too small for a heavy AA gun. The 105 was okay, but you look at the sheer number of guns that you had to fit on the Scharnhorst or the Bismarcks, or the split that you had to put on things like the Hippers and the Deutschlands, and then the weight issues you have when they try and stick 5.9-inch guns on some of the German destroyers. And you think they're going, it's not like the 127-128mm, whatever you want to call it, was a new weapon. It had been around for a while. They should have navalized it and installed it as a dual-purpose weapon across the board much, much sooner than they eventually tried to. I mean, it's not going to entirely solve the stability issues for German destroyers, but it will go some way to addressing them, and it would give them the ability to defend themselves with heavy AA, which, especially for a smaller navy, you absolutely need. And then, so look at the Deutschlands. Instead of having 3 relatively ineffective 88mm and 8 150mm, you could potentially have a dozen 127, let's say, millimeter guns. The Hippers, admittedly, you probably have a straight swap of 105s for 127, so you still have a dozen on them. But look at the German battleships. You've got 26 secondary guns on the Scharnhorst, 28 on the Bismarcks, but in both cases you only get an 8-gun anti-aircraft broadside. Swap that out for 127mm or 128mm, whatever, and you've now got on both ships, actually, thanks to the layout of the various secondary mounts on both, a 14-gun dual-purpose broadside, which is, that's 4 more guns than even a US fast battleship. 6 guns more than a King George V. Thrain15 asks, what were the impacts to naval design practices and operational procedures in the wake of the Peacemaker accident? On a global scale, not really all that much. I mean, gun explosions weren't exactly unheard of, but the particular details of the Peacemaker accident, as much as they caused any reaction overseas, essentially amounted to, oh look, they tried to copy one of our designs poorly. Well, what did you expect? But in the US, there are 3 main impacts. Firstly, it leads to a temporary cessation in a new US idea for ship construction, which was embodied in the Princeton, which was small ships, but those small ships to carry 1 or 2 really, really big guns. That would eventually come back. Look at Kearsarge, for example. But, it did cause an understandable reluctance to go for that idea again in the immediate future. Secondly, it rather severely stymied John Ericsson's ability to work with the US Navy, because although he'd been involved with the design and construction of Princeton and her equipment, it was Stockton who'd been entirely responsible for the Peacemaker gun, the one that blew up, but because Ericsson was associated with and Stockton had more friends in higher places, it meant that Ericsson somehow ended up being blamed to a certain degree for the disaster. And it wasn't until some shenanigans went on to actually get him the contract for Monitor that he really re-entered US Navy life. Well, he wasn't part of the US Navy, but involvement with, I suppose you could say. And the other big change was that although enthusiasm for large guns per se hadn't gone away in the US Navy, the enthusiasm for building them or trusting ones built in the US as opposed to ones built overseas, like the other big gun on the Princeton, was somewhat diminished until you had a sort of mini revolution in gun design, which you saw with the Dahlgren and Rodman guns, where admittedly there's a bit of clever engineering going into their construction, but also they're using a very basic engineering principle of massively overbuild the thing so that it can't possibly fail, as I said, as well as some more intricate advancements. And that leads to this whole generation where you get absolutely monstrous, for the time, 15 and even 20-inch guns, and of course the more regular 9 and 11-inch guns, in this sort of, well, a soda bottle style, they call it in the US, construction. Absolutely massive, could survive the apocalypse level construction. And that is fairly characteristic of the US Navy for quite a while, until they move on again technologically, and they're able to then catch up with the somewhat slimmer, somewhat lighter gun construction of the European powers as you move further into the latter part of the 19th century. Patrick Donnelly asks, how would Taiho have handled the 1942 carrier battles? Well, partly this depends if we're sending Taiho back in time with the aircraft that she was also designed to operate, because obviously those would give her a significant operational advantage. But if we're looking just at the carrier herself, Taiho actually would have handled the 1942 carrier battles pretty well. Now, you might be wondering why. Are you going to say the armoured flight deck? Yes, I'm going to say the armoured flight deck, but specifically because when you look at her flight deck thickness, it's very similar to the Illustrious class. And the Illustrious class, although generally speaking, they're dated to be rated against 500-pound semi-armour piercing or armour piercing bombs, and everyone immediately goes, yes, well, the Dauntlesses drop 1,000-pounders. You have two additional factors to consider. Firstly, the Dauntlesses don't just drop 1,000-pound armour-piercing bombs. They also have access to 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs, whose armour penetration capabilities are obviously considerably less, and the scouting Dauntlesses very often carry 500-pound bombs. And at some of the carrier battles in 1942, some of the Japanese carriers were rather severely incapacitated by hits from 500-pounders. Additionally, when you look at the calculations that were done for the Illustrious class, they were given a margin of protection, or they were rated with a margin of protection against 1,000-pound armour-piercing bombs as well, providing that those bombs were dropped at under 4,500 feet, because the higher you drop a bomb, the more time it has to accelerate towards its terminal velocity. So the calculation went, well, a 1,000-pound armour-piercing bomb drop below 4,500 feet won't have enough time to attain a speed such that it can punch through the deck armour. But obviously, if you drop it higher and it goes faster, or theoretically, if you drop it from a platform that is diving faster, then that calculation is going to vary. But when you look at the Battle of Midway, for understandable reasons of wanting accuracy, the US Dauntlesses were dropping their bombs at a very low altitude, well below 4,500 feet, which means that even in a situation like the Battle of Midway, where we know Japanese carriers were taking multiple 1,000-pound hits, assuming that Taiho was in the same state of flight readiness as everybody else, for whatever reason, so assuming that most of the aircraft aboard are down in the hangar deck, fueled up and ready to go, in theory at least, her flight deck should be able to handle those low-altitude 1,000-pounder drops. And, supply that depending if you send her to Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, Eastern Solomons, etc. In pretty much all those cases, at least on paper, as long as US dive bombers keep dropping at 1,000, 2,000, 2,500 feet, her armoured flight deck should be able to tank those hits. It's not going to do great things to that flight deck, and it might knock her out of combat for a little bit while they put fires out and patch things up, but in theory, she will survive those hits, and those bombs shouldn't penetrate the hangar and set her on fire. So, for example, if she was at Midway, she would survive and possibly send off a strike, depending if she's hit in the first wave or the second. If she's hit in the first wave and she puts herself at least partially operational, then you have Taiho and Hiryu's strikes coming in. Obviously, Hiryu eventually taking out Yorktown, but who knows what's going to happen to Hornet or Enterprise at that point. And if she's in the place of Hiryu, so not hit in the first wave, well, she sends out her attack waves, takes out Yorktown, but then the follow-up attacks that down Hiryu probably don't down Taiho. So the Japanese are up one carrier going into Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, which she probably also will survive. At least as long as the only major threat to her is being bombed by aircraft. Nosdormu89 asks, what countries would have had the resources to build a Yamato-like ship, and what would it look like if said country did build it? So I'm going to assume for the sake of this answer that you mean a ship of roughly similar displacement, so high 60,000s of tons, possibly even pushing into 70,000 ton range, as opposed to specifically has to have 18-inch guns. So in that respect, in terms of realistic ships, so has the infrastructure and could actually put it to use to a point where they could have plausibly built such a vessel. There are two nations other than the Japanese who definitely could have done so, that being the British and the Americans, and one nation which kind of maybe could have done so, that being the Germans. So for the Germans, that would be the H-41s, which are the very last of the at least theoretically plausible H-class designs that the Germans came up with. H-39 is perfectly doable. H-41 is, shall we say, it is technically within the capability of the German shipbuilding industry to do, but they would need significant infrastructure changes and upgrades in order to actually construct the thing, much as the Japanese had to massively expand their infrastructure to build the Yamatos. So they could have done it, but they didn't have the ability to do it at the time that they were looking at designing it, but they could have then given themselves the ability to do so. And the H-41, like pretty much all the H-class designs, to a greater or lesser degree, just looks like a Bismarck run through various scales on a Xerox copier. The other two nations, though, they're a little bit more interesting. So if you want to go for a Yamato displacement project that the US Navy is looking at, then essentially that comes up with what I dub the Long Tanner. So you've got the Montana, which you can see here, armed with 12 16-inch 50 caliber guns. However, Montana's displacement is somewhat less than Yamato's. Long Tanner is essentially Montana, but capable of going well north of 30 knots, almost Iowa kind of speeds, and that requires a longer hull with more powerful engines, and that pushes the displacement up into Yamato-like territory. So essentially, the American version of a Yamato, purely by displacement, would be considerably faster, armed with more but slightly smaller guns, and dimensionally, at least lengthwise, would be considerably bigger. And then for the British, they have the theoretical capacity to build such a vessel as long as they don't mind that vessel pretty much only being serviceable in the UK, again without major infrastructure upgrades, but they do technically have the infrastructure in place to build and maintain such a ship in Britain. And the design that comes closest to potentially actually being plausibly considered and isn't, one of the really, really, really ridiculous post-war, let's put a foot plus of armour on the deck and nothing on the side designs, would be some of the final speculative versions of what you might do for the Lion class, which, actually both Long Tanner and the various speculative lines I've covered in the post-war battleships video, but there were a few Lion descendant designs which were Yamato scale displacement, usually a little bit quicker, but again armed with 16-inch rather than 18-inch guns. Primark 359 asks, in the recent Drydock you mentioned Navy Field, and while you did mention the brick-shaped spread of the Nelsons, you didn't mention the obligatory KitaKami opening spread at the start of every battle, the rainbows of shells from certain ships that were firing exclusively above 45 degrees. Yeah, I remember both of those. I assume that the latter is laughable except for coastal pre-sighted mortars and howitzers, yeah, pretty much. But for the former, what was the closest that KitaKami or her Kuma refit sisters came to unleashing a spread at the enemy? Or in what engagement were they not in attendance where such a spread could have made a significant impact? The two Kumas that were refitted to torpedo god standards were KitaKami and Oi. Neither came anywhere close to actually engaging in battle. They did escort for the fleet in missions where they were nowhere near any confrontation. The closest they came to ever being in battle was that they were part of the Aleutian operation at the same time as the Battle of Midway, and of course that wasn't really contested, so that was that. And then after that they started to have their torpedo launcher numbers reduced and being used as transports. So that's pretty much it for their real life potential for engagement. But in terms of engagements where they weren't and might have made a significant impact, Well, you might be tempted to say some of the ABDA command battles, but let's face it, the Japanese Navy didn't really need all that much help winning those battles. Spamming a bunch of extra long lances, yeah, a few more ships would have died sooner, but they died anyway, so without the Japanese taking all that many losses. I think the biggest contribution they could have made, and admittedly at this point they were already being looked at for transport duty rather than pure torpedo spammers, but they still had a lot of torpedoes on board, and to be honest, even as part transport, part torpedo spammer ship, might have made quite a significant change, would be the Guadalcanal campaign. Because, well, what did the Japanese need during the Guadalcanal campaign? Fast transport ships. What have KitaKami and Oi been turned into by that point? Fast, sort of, transport ships, but with a hilarious amount of self-defense capability in the form of all those long lances. So they could have made a significant impact both in dropping off supplies, being fast enough to get there and drop off supplies, but also in the various night actions. Obviously, the Japanese don't need all that much help at first salvo, but in subsequent engagements, the ability to dump quote-unquote only 3 full launchers worth of torpedoes per side into the water. I mean, it increases the number of long lances in the water quite a lot, so that could make the difference between ships that were damaged, like having their bows blown off, being sunk instead of damaged, or ships that escaped damage being heavily damaged or sunk instead of coming off scot-free. So, I mean, it's probably not going to necessarily change the entire outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign, but they certainly could inflict a lot more losses on the US forces, and if they're acting in concert with the destroyers, which they're fast enough to keep up with as transports, they might get a few more supplies and men and equipment, of course, over to the Japanese garrison, which might extend their ability to hold out there. And even in something like, say, Washington and Kiroshima's knockdown drag-out duel, if you have KitaKami and Oi in the escort formation and they just dump long lances everywhere, there's a chance that one or more of them might find one of Lee's battleships. HMS Impractical asks, I've got the impression that splinter wounds were the most likely cause of injury or death in battle aboard an Age of Sail warship. That made me wonder, why did people stop wearing armour in sea battles? Did anyone try an Age of Sail equivalent of a FlaK-jacket to protect against splinters? The drop-off in armour aboard ships happened for 2 primary reasons. Firstly, boarding actions became less and less of the main way to win a fight, and naval gunfire became more and more so that. Obviously, boarding still had a significant place, but if you are no longer primarily aiming to win a fight by boarding, you begin to see a reduction of the number of soldiers aboard, and the soldiers are the ones who are usually wearing the armour. The sailors, even for much further back into the medieval period, generally are wearing little to no armour. So, for example, here's a picture or painting of the Battle of Lepanto, and you can see, because at this point, although gunnery does have a very significant impact at Lepanto, the majority of the fighting is still this mass hand-to-hand melee, so as you can see, even though we're talking about the late 1500s, there's still a significant amount of armour being worn. But very soon after that, as you get into the 1600s, and you start to see combat really moving over to gunnery with boarding as kind of a finishing action, armour becomes less and less available, less prevalent, I should say. The other factor, the big one, is the increasing numbers and effectiveness of firearms. And obviously this is kind of paralleling developments on land as well. And that means that armour is actually reducing already, well before it becomes extinct. So back in the medieval period, proper high medieval period, you have full plate armour being used on ships. Even then, people are beginning to strip their armour down a little bit because they have a certain degree of lower protection from ship's gunnels and forecastles and stern castles and so forth. And you need the flexibility to be able, and the loss of weight that entails to move without potentially drowning yourself. And then as firearms, handheld firearms, this has become more and more common, armour has to thicken up to defend against that, and that means the weight of armour increases, therefore the extremities start to become unarmoured, because if you have a fully encasing suit of full plate that is bulletproof, when we're talking about arquebuses and so forth, it's just unsustainably heavy, and particularly additional heavy weight on the limbs makes things much more difficult. And so essentially armor starts to go down to helmets, backplate, breastplate, and tassets to protect the upper legs. And that's actually the stage of armor you see quite often at Lepanto, certainly among the Holy League side. And I mean, it does have its downsides. There's quite a lot of various reports of various people aboard those ships being shot repeatedly in the legs by arrows because they don't have full plate leg protection anymore. And obviously, even that armor isn't necessarily going to protect you from an arquebus or whatever, either if it's particularly powerful handgun or if you have lower quality armor. Santa Cruz, who is at the Battle of Lepanto, he has really high quality armor, and we know this because his buckler manages to deflect an arquebus shot, but one of the other Lepanto commanders, he gets shot by a similar weapon, and the shot goes straight through his buckler and his breastplate and kills him. So clearly somebody either skimped out on the armor or there was some failure of manufacture there. But the rowers and so forth, unless you happen to be a Venetian paid rower, aren't wearing armor, even in this kind of environment. And simply put, when you are now primarily on a gun-armed vessel, the heat and the constant effort you're having to exert for loading and firing the guns, it just makes wearing armor impractical. Yes, you might be slightly protected from splinters, but you can't wear full plate and load and fire a gun in close quarters on a ship of the line without dying of heat stroke very quickly. And if you were wearing kind of Lepanto-style partial protection, you're still going to be hindered in your movements, you're still going to have massive overheating issues, and your limbs, and potentially your face as well, are not going to be guarded from splinters. Yes, it might save a little bit from torso hits, but at the end of the day, the loss of efficiency for actually loading and firing the guns, as I said, heat exhaustion, is probably going to be actively worse for your ship than a slightly increased survival rate because you're not being hit so much by splinters. And the big problem with a FlaK-jacket or similar would be that if you're not using plate, it's going to be even thicker, and that means even more heat retention. And again, if you're stuck on the gun deck of a ship of the line, the one thing you don't want is something that is going to cause a significant buildup of heat. And finally for this week, Hugh Fisher asks, can Strasbourg be considered a battleship when she's only protected against 11-inch or 12-inch guns? It seems to me that when she's laid down, she can't stand up to 14-inch gunfire from older Japanese or US ships, 15-inch gunfire from old British ships, or the 16-inch gunfire from their biggest vessels. Well, I think whether or not you count Dunkirk and Strasbourg as battlecruisers or battleships, it depends on how you interpret what is a battleship. Now, obviously, some people just go with, oh, well, that navy called this thing X, therefore it is X. And okay, yeah, I understand that why people take that approach sometimes. I don't personally think it's a valid one, because then you end up with very weird circumstances where something that we otherwise would call a battlecruiser is a battleship, something we would otherwise call a battleship is a battlecruiser purely because of an arbitrary designation that somebody gave it. And we also have things where, a ship whose designation we all understand and know suddenly becomes not that thing, particularly when you look at Germany in World War I. Because what is von der Tann, or what is Seydlitz, what is Der Flinger, what is Lutzow? Everyone goes, battlecruiser. A few people argue the Der Flinger class fast battleships. They're wrong, but they can argue it, at least in my opinion. But if you look at the German designation, if we're going to go, really technically into what are the designations given by the nation, that is what we're going to call them. The Germans call them Große Kreuzer, or large cruiser. Similar to the designation that the Alaskas get. So therefore, technically, Germany doesn't have any battle cruisers. They have large cruisers, which are obviously a very different thing. So anyway, that aside, looking at Strasbourg, one of the rules of thumb for battleships is that they should be obviously designed to fight other battleships, and they should be able to withstand either their own gunfire or the gunfire from the ships they're designed to fight against at reasonable battle ranges. Now, at the time that she's laid down, the only battleships that the French are plausibly thinking of fighting are the Scharnhorsts and the old Italian refits, because the Littorios haven't been built yet, and so they're looking at 11 or 12-inch guns. And, well, as you said, Strasbourg is capable of withstanding 11 or 12-inch gunfire. They're not thinking about Strasbourg having to stand up against Fuso, Issei, Nagato, Hood, Warspite, Tennessee, or Colorado. So they're armouring it against the battleship threats that they consider. Also, interestingly enough, thanks to the angling on Strasbourg's armour, if you look at her performance against her own guns, then that other rule of thumb, can she withstand her own guns at battle ranges? She actually can, despite the rather remarkable performance of the French 13-inch gun for its size. At least at the longer battle ranges, thanks to the angling of her armour, she does have a margin of protection against her own guns, which Dunkirk does not. So I would argue, therefore, that in the broader terms, Strasbourg is designed for and built as and has the protection of a battleship. Albeit, yes, she's not protected against every other battleship, but there are multiple cases where that is in fact the case. I mean, look at Nagato when she's launched, for example. She has big 16-inch guns. She's undeniably a battleship by pretty much any metric, but her armor is fairly anemic. There are ships, quite a lot of ships in existence at the time that Nagato was constructed, that at a reasonable battle range could expect to penetrate Nagato's belt armor with their existing 14 and 15-inch guns, let alone the 16-inch guns of the Colorados and Nelsons, which are more her contemporaries. And yet she's still called a battleship, so I don't think the fact that there were some other ships in existence which could get through Strasbourg's main belt at the time she was constructed technically rules her out of being a battleship. And that brings us to the end of the Drydock for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and I hope to see you again in another video fairly soon. Cheers for now.